Hello, everyone. My name is Severin, and this is a lecture I put together on working class environmentalism. This lecture is based on the course material developed by Sam Lloyd at the University of Victoria for his class on the psychology of transformative climate action. I had the privilege of being invited as a guest speaker during the last lecture unit of this class. And a little bit about me is that I have a master's degree in environmental psychology from the University of Victoria. I did my thesis work on the attitudes towards renewable transitions in the coal mining communities of British Columbia. I was a senior policy advisor for the Emily Lowen's leadership campaign on the BC Green Party, and I'm currently a regional representative for Vancouver Island and the Sunshine Coast on the BC Green Party Provincial Council. And today I'm going to be talking about the way that class politics has shaped the climate movement as we know it in both good and bad ways, and the way that a class analysis and specifically the engagement of the working class can play a role in improving our strategy as we organize against the climate crisis. Now, before we get into the bulk of the lecture material, I want to begin with a moment of reckoning. Now, the climate movement as we know it, in the form of activism and mass movements to halt climate change, began in around the 1980s, and it grew out of the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, was founded in 1988, which was one of the first times that climate change was being addressed on a global stage. And since then, and basically during the entire lifespan of the climate movement, we have emitted 50% of all carbon emissions. Now, this is a period of ample social movements, readily available information, and mass education campaigns. So the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, why isn't it working? So this is the question that I'm going to try to answer in this lecture, as well as what could work and how we can do it. I'm going to argue that the reason the climate movement has not yet succeeded is because it has failed to integrate class politics into how it understands the climate crisis and in how it organizes against it. But before we fully get into that, we need to build a bit of a foundation. We need to start with an introduction to class politics. And first, we need to ask, what is class? Now, when I asked this question to the classroom, one of the first answers I got was income or socioeconomic status. And this is definitely part of it. We understand class as an indicator of one's wealth, but it's not the full picture. For example, a tenured professor can make as much money at an elite university as a journeyman electrician. And we would not immediately assume that these two people occupy the same class, because we also understand class as integrating an element of social status. And in a working class environment, the tenured professor might actually have less social status than a journeyman electrician, but in an elite academic setting, the journeyman electrician might have less social status than the tenured professor. So we also understand that class has a role of identity playing into it. People will also self-identify as middle class or working class, and they might not agree, or the people in the same level of income and same social status might identify with class in different ways. And so there's a lot of really useful and interesting research of these different kinds of class dynamics that we can learn by looking into the way that identity and income factor into class. But we need something a little bit more concrete for today's topic. And that's why for today's lecture, we're going to be using the Marxist view of class, which says that one's class is determined by your relationship to how value is produced in our economy. And you can determine one's relationship by asking the question, who owns and controls the means of production? By means of production, we mean things like a factory, the land the factory is on, and the machines inside the factory that make it run. And I could spend a whole lecture getting into the nitty-gritty details of this and all the nuances that go into it. But for the purposes of today's class, we're going to simplify it down to two main classes in society. And that is the capitalist class, who owns the resources needed to produce goods in our economy, and the working class, those who work for the people who own the means of production. So to determine one's class position, we need to ask questions like, who owns the land and resources and the means of extracting and processing them? And if you don't own them, then what is your relationship to the supply chain? So if the capitalist class is defined by their ownership of the means of production, the working class is defined by the fact that they must sell their labor in order to survive. So this includes many different types of workers, including service workers, industrial workers, care workers, gig workers, etc. But the common denominator is that they all lack the ownership of their own productive assets. They cannot do their job in the factory themselves without all of the equipment inside the factory. Uber Eats delivery person cannot do their job without the platform and the algorithm that allows them to be connected to the customers. And of course, this is a huge bucket and is really complicated and is not just the clean break between bosses and workers. It can be segmented into oblivion, but there is one segment worth identifying of the working class that we're going to spend a lot of time on today, and that is the professional managerial class. This specific segment of the working class needs to be singled out because it has some important distinctions from the traditional working class, and importantly for us, it has overwhelmingly shaped the climate movement as it exists. And we're going to look closer into how the class position of professionals and managers has shaped the climate movement. But again, before we get there, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into class analysis. Class analysis is a way to understand society by examining how economic relationships shape power, interests, and social conflict. And class analysis asks questions like, who owns the wealth in our society? Who controls the workplaces in which we spend most of our day? Who benefits from the economic policies passed by our governments? And by answering these questions, we can better understand why certain political and economic outcomes occur. Class analysis focuses on the distribution of power and resources between the classes of our society. And a great example of this is the background image here, which is a political cartoon I found from 1889 that makes fun of the fact that late 19th century economic policies were reproducing the same grim levels of social inequality of the Middle Ages. And so without a class analysis lens, we might be tempted to think that there was little in common between the arrangement of industrial capitalism and middle-aged feudalism. However, by looking at the class arrangements in society, we can understand that actually they reproduce very similar types of social dynamics where, although they are not lords and barons, the capitalists in the late 19th century were able to concentrate such high levels of wealth and control over the economy by running monopolies, that the role that they played was very similar to feudal lords, and that they had a similar level of control and influence over the working class majority as those lords and barons did over the peasants who lived on the lands of which they owned. At its most fundamental, class analysis is distinct by focusing on structures over individuals. For example, let's look at educational outcomes by asking the question of why do some students perform better in school than others? Without a class analysis, you might be tempted to think that some students succeed because they try harder than other students. But a class analysis lens would ask, what are the accesses to resources that each student has? Do they have similar levels of access to tutors, to safe housing, and to time to study? Do their families have similar levels of income? Do their schools have similar levels of funding? And by looking at these questions, this gives us a better understanding of the material conditions that shape social outcomes and human behavior, and leaves us less open to biases and prejudices that might cloud our judgment. Class analysis also focuses on material incentives as the underlying determinant of values, norms, and cultures. Now, values, norms, and cultures are very important, especially from a psychological perspective. There's a lot of really valuable insights we can get by looking at values, norms, and cultures. But class analysis understands that these are shaped by the underlying material conditions. So, for example, we could ask the question of why do Dutch people ride bicycles more than North Americans? Is there something about Dutch culture that they just value physical activity, they value lower carbon forms of transit? Or is it because the built environment in the Netherlands has ample cycling infrastructure, and that because of the layout of their material environment, because of the density of their cities, for example, it's actually faster and cheaper for them to bike to work instead of driving because they can get there just as fast and they don't have to make a car payment every month. So this is an example of why the material conditions can help us understand why certain social outcomes are produced. So why is class analysis important? It's important because this helps us identify who holds economic and political power in our society, and it also helps us understand how institutions reinforce that power. For example, although we expect our politicians to represent their democratic constituents, class analysis helps reveal the degree to which capitalists and corporate interests will lobby politicians to change the legislative output of our government. And class analysis can also help us understand how capitalists and corporate interests will buy media outlets to skew the way they cover current events. So this class analysis helps clarify which groups benefit from existing systems and explain why certain social outcomes are being produced. Class analysis also helps us dismantle culture war distractions by looking at the true determinants behind social outcomes. For example, we understand that a lot of culture war narratives, such as the really alarming and problematic levels of transphobia and anti-immigrant bigotry in our current political systems, are often literally focus grouped by corporate interest to divide the working class and to pit working people against marginalized groups instead of the 1% who actually are perpetrating the vast majority of violence in society. And class analysis is important because it helps us determine effective tactics and goals for our organizing. It can connect our political action to real lived experiences, and it can help us identify our shared interests, which helps us build coalitions and guide our organizing efforts. Now, I want to take a moment to practice applying class analysis to climate politics. And I think a really good example where we can do this is by looking at the Yellow Vest protests. Now, a lot of you might not remember, but this was a huge mass mobilization in 2018 in France, where thousands of working class people took to the streets wearing iconic high-vis vests that were understood to be a working class indicator to protest the implementation of a carbon tax that was expected to raise fuel prices. Now, the mainstream media coverage of this mass demonstration at that time framed it mostly as a backward, reactionary, conservative movement that was fighting against the most established and common sense form of climate policy at the time. And this is what I would identify as a classic culture war framing, right versus left. And to a degree, it was true. We understand that there were right-wing groups that were organizing alongside and as a part of the Yellow Vest protests. But is it sufficient? What does this miss? And a class analysis lens can help us tease out some of the things that might be driving this kind of outpouring of reaction against what we might be tempted to think as a good common sense climate policy. So let's look at the class makeup of the protesters. If the majority are working class people, class analysis reminds us that the working class has experienced a decades-long erosion of their standards of living and might actually have legitimate cost of living concerns. Affordability is a very common talking point now in politics, but it certainly wasn't in 2018. We can also look at the material conditions of the protesters. Perhaps they don't have sufficient access to public transit and therefore have no choice but to fuel their cars with gasoline and therefore are being penalized for something that's beyond their control. We can also look at the class dynamics of how this carbon tax was being applied. For example, at that time, there were massive carve-outs for fossil fuel corporations. And so these protesters had legitimate concerns around the justice of the largest polluters being exempt while normal working people are being penalized. So this is a great example of how class analysis can help us cut through some of the fog and misunderstanding and confusion that is created by traditional media narratives and culture war frames, and can help us better identify why a climate policy that we might have thought was good, was encountering resistance, and therefore how to strengthen our policies using a class analysis to make them more effective and more politically supported. So now that we have a bit of a foundation on class analysis, we're going to apply it to climate change and see how that helps us understand the problem that we're facing better. We're going to look at the way that different classes are positioned in relation to climate change and do a bit of a dissection on how class politics has shaped the climate movement up until now. And I'm going to be taking a lot from this book, Climate Change is Class War by Matt Huber, which I would highly recommend you all read if you're interested in digging deeper into the topics that we're covering today. So that brings us back to the capitalist class at the top of the class spectrum. And again, most simply, these are the ones who own the means of production. They might own the factory, they might own the land the factory is on, and they might own the machines inside the factory that the workers use. And while they may choose to work, such as by serving as the CEO of their own company, they do not have to. Importantly, their wealth, and by extension their power and influence, does not come from a wage that they earn, but from the surplus value that is generated by all of the workers that they employ. They could just as easily, or perhaps more easily, sit on a beach all day while they collect economic rent that is generated by all of the people that they pay to run the company in their stead. And we're not actually going to spend a lot of time right now on them because I think you guys mostly get the point. But there are a few different segments of the capitalist class specifically oriented around climate change that are worth exploring a little bit. Now, of course, the most immediate association of capitalists with climate change is, of course, fossil fuel companies for obvious reasons. And this is what we'll refer to here as extractive capital, which is all of the private interests involved in identifying and extracting the natural resources such as oil, natural gas, or rare earth minerals and mining. And these are very deeply related but distinct from what we'll call industrial capital, which is all of the private interests that take those raw resources and process them, such as taking those kind of raw mineral ore and oil or gas and turning it into steel or concrete or petrochemicals. And so they are often operating in slightly different segments of the economy, but are also typically deeply invested in fossil fuel production so that they maintain access to the cheaper natural resources that they require to produce the industrial goods that they do. Now, this is only true for now. One day we might have, for example, an electric furnace that is capable of producing steel cheaper than traditional steel production, which is still fossil fuel dependent. But until we reach that point of technological innovation, these two segments of the fossil capital are deeply entwined. Now, really importantly, I cannot overstate how significant it is to always remember the role that finance capital plays in funding and maintaining wealth investments in both extractive and industrial capital process. And so although banks might not be immediately associated with climate change the same way that fossil fuel companies are, these financial institutions are often having tens of billions of dollars invested in, for example, all of the identified oil reserves that Exxon or BP might have on retainer and that have not yet explored. And so while finance capital might appear to be a little bit more energy neutral in terms of its preference for fossil fuels versus renewable energy, it in fact is not, and does typically have a huge amount of historic and accrued wealth invested along the lines of continued fossil fuel production. And this is why that divestment is such an important lever to use in terms of targeting how, for example, our universities manage our their endowments, as well as pension funds manage our retirements by investing them in fossil fuels and things that do not actually align with our well-being or our present or future. Now, those segments that we just covered are some of the more traditionally identified corporate villains in terms of climate spaces, but there are a few more segments that are worth identifying that receive a little bit less attention. And one is what we'll call electricity capital, which is all the private interests invested in the production of electricity, which again you might suspect to be rather energy neutral in terms of whether they're using oil and gas to produce electricity or renewables. And there's also an emerging segment of the capitalist class oriented around renewable energy, which we'll call green capital. Now, both of these segments of the capitalist class might be less clearly malicious from a climate perspective, but it is important for our organizing efforts to understand that while they may not be necessarily oriented against climate action, that does not necessarily make them our allies. For example, a lot of the solar companies featured here in this slide, some of the biggest solar companies today, are notoriously anti-union. Additionally, Tesla, I don't know, I think my bubble might be covering it, notoriously hates public transit and opposes many legislative attempts to roll out public transit in the United States. And both of these segments of the capitalist class love mining, regardless of how sustainable or inhumane it is. So these are just important things to remember, that although there might be, and increasingly will be moving into the future, segments of the capitalist class that might appear or attempt to align themselves with popular movements, we need to remember that our class analysis must be applied to these segments of the capitalist class as well, to make sure that they are actually supporting the needs of the majority of our society, which is, again, the working class. So that was a bit of a tour of the capitalist class and how it relates to climate change, and brings us into our next segment, which is the professional managerial class. Now, the professional managerial class, as is indicated by the name, also does include managers, which are technically workers. They also work for a wage. They do not own the company that they're employed by. But importantly, they are tasked with representing the interests of the capitalist class on their behalf. Additionally, this class is largely made up of professionals, such as professors, doctors, researchers, scientists, journalists, analysts. All of these types of workers that do, again, have to labor for a wage, but importantly are highly educated or are trained in vocations. And what makes these professionals distinct from traditional workers is that these often focus on mental labor or knowledge work that is defined by its distance from industrial mass production. And we're going to spend a bit of time on this group because the PMC, which is how I'm going to abbreviate it, has made up the bulk of the climate movement. And so understanding the PMC's class dynamics will help us reflect on how this distinct segment of the working class has influenced the climate movement in both good and bad ways. So one of the most significant implications of the PMC being overrepresented in the climate movement is a tendency to fixate on consumption as one of the drivers of climate change. Now, the PMC has traditionally been associated with a relatively comfortable standard of living that might have included a large suburban house, multiple cars, easy access to cheap electronic goods like TVs, and this has created a kind of hyper-awareness of economic consumption that is often projected onto the working class as a whole and society as a whole. and was traditionally recognized as one of the core drivers of carbon emissions. And this often came with a feeling of guilt or insecurity over the comfortable lifestyle that this segment of the working class enjoyed, while the consequences of climate change were becoming increasingly clear. And this propelled one of the largest and most high-profile climate solutions of most of my childhood and adolescence from the 2000s to the 2010s, which is the carbon footprint. The carbon footprint was often held up as one of the best ways to popularize climate action and environmental consciousness amongst the majority of our society. And I'm sure you all are familiar with that or learned about it in school at some point. So I want to take another moment to try and apply a class analysis to the carbon footprint as a climate solutions. And so maybe just take like 10 seconds to try and think about what is wrong with the carbon footprint from a class perspective. You may have encountered critiques that the carbon footprint focuses on individual action over collective action, and some other kind of critiques of the carbon footprint based around its kind of strategy. But I want you to think about what, specifically from a class perspective, this misses. How about, for one, the carbon footprint assumes that all of our consumption is equally problematic, and that by all of us reducing our consumption, we will therefore reduce carbon emissions. Now, this ignores the reality that consumption is not a problem for the vast majority of workers. We live right now in times where 40% of Americans cannot afford a $400 unexpected expense, and the majority of people spend over half of their income on rent. So are these people that we are saying should consume less? Additionally, even if you want to focus on lifestyle emissions as one of the drivers of climate change as opposed to fossil fuel corporations and fossil fuel extraction, research shows that over 50% of lifestyle emissions come from the top 10% of the income ladder. So the effect that having the carbon footprint as this universal solution has is that it flattens this power dynamic, and it redistributes the culpability of emissions that are overwhelmingly the burden of the top 10% and the wealthiest slice of our society, and distributes that responsibility onto all of us, and importantly, onto the poorest 50% of our society, which are only responsible for 10% of total lifestyle consumption emissions. So this is one example that we're going to keep coming back to of the way that a lot of these traditional climate solutions and the most high-profile climate analysis that are advocated for in kind of establishment and mainstream spaces tend to obscure the power dynamic that is hidden behind our society, specifically between the rich and the working class majority. But there is another hidden problem with the carbon footprint that a materialist analysis of production can help reveal to us. So also take another second just to think on what does the carbon footprint assume by focusing on consumption as the root problem of climate change rather than on production, which is what we were talking about at the start of this lecture, on the companies that are producing industrial goods or producing refined natural resources. So the focus on consumption as a driver of economic production assumes that a directional relationship whereby us altering the habits of our consumption, we can therefore control what is produced in our economy. There is an implicit assumption that if we all decided to buy more environmentally sustainable products, that therefore more environmentally sustainable products would be made. But this is not actually the case. There are a lot of examples where we don't have an option to buy more environmentally sustainable products. For example, if you want to reduce your consumption of red meat, but you live in a rural area with no access to vegetarian alternatives, you might not have any purchasing power to shift this kind of economic relationship. And this is what we call the myth of consumer sovereignty. And this is a very common underlying premise behind a lot of liberal climate solutions, which focus on the consumers as the ones holding the power to dictate what is made and sold in our economy. But we recognize that actually this is not the case at all. For example, we only ever are allowed to purchase things that a capitalist has already determined they can make money off of. So what does that mean about our power in the economy if our options are inherently limited to what the 1% can make a profit from? Again, this is another example of how these kind of climate solutions obscure the power dynamic that is actually operating in our society and in our economy. So the second main implication of the PMC being overrepresented in the climate movement is that due to the importance that education plays in its life, the PMC tends to fixate on the knowledge of climate science as one of the most important levers to wield in climate organizing, and overemphasizes historically the threat of climate denial as one of the roots of climate change. Now, of course, I'm a huge advocate of public education on climate science, but when we're encountering these kind of traditional climate solutions, there are two questions I want you to keep asking. One, who does this target? And two, what does this miss? For the first one, you'll probably anticipate that, well, yeah, this targets the majority of society as opposed to the capitalist class who owns most of the power in our society and our economy. But what about the second question, two, what does this miss? How about the fact that despite electing Donald Trump twice, who has obviously been disastrous for climate policy, 80% of Americans support a Green New Deal? Are these people that need more education? Is deeply ingrained climate denial part of the reason that they voted for a huge enemy to climate policy? Or are these people's support and relationship to certain climate policies more influenced by a perception of material impact over an awareness of the mechanics of a greenhouse gas effect? Now, this fixation on knowledge also leads the PMC to overly focus on quote-unquote smart, technocratic policy fixes. For example, you don't actually have to read the study that I've put up here on this slide, but this is an example of a research paper that's advocating for the use of flexible regulations as a preferred climate solution. And a flexible regulation is essentially like a very narrowly tailored and kind of cleverly structured form of regulation that is being advocated here, for example, because it seems to face lesser political acceptability barriers. So this attempts to advance climate solutions without engaging in any form of a mass political project, and therefore it implicitly accepts what is realistic and what is doable within the bounds of the existing political status quo. And so this often reduces our set of available climate solutions to market solutions, such as taxes, rebates. And in this kind of political framework, electric vehicles are often identified as a common sense climate solution, but public transit is often opposed because it's not politically feasible. So again, what does this miss? How about, for one, there's no mass appeal here. They're not going to get thousands of people protesting in the streets in favor for a flexible regulation. And therefore, this makes them incredibly easy to roll back after being passed, even if they are successfully passed. There's also no clear material benefits. How does this actually help the lives of the working class majority who might be struggling? Affordable heat pumps are a great thing, absolutely. But is that really enough to compel you to advocate for this policy solution when you can't afford groceries or are struggling to make your car payments? I want to make a caveat that this type of research and also this type of policy is not necessarily worthless. I do think, for example, affordable heat pump programs are very good, and any kind of regulation, flexible or otherwise, is absolutely essential. But we need to examine the political assumptions that are being advocated in this type of research and in this type of policy preference, and consider the implications that overly emphasizing this type of politically acceptable climate solutions makes. And the reason I chose this study in particular is because this is from one of my favorite professors at the University of Victoria, and is just an example that I want to reiterate, which is to always question your professors. And there are a lot of people in the professional managerial class that are doing really incredible, really good work. And there are probably a lot of professors at university that are also doing really great shit. But that does not mean that their high degree of educational credentials are not shaping their political outlook. And this is one of the ways in which a class analysis is evergreen, especially in university settings. So the third and final implication of the PMC's overrepresentation in the climate movement that we're going to talk about is what Matt Huber calls the radical variant. And this is a portion of the climate movement that uplifts types of climate solutions such as climate justice, which centers the colonial dynamics of the global north against the global south, as well as the disproportionate responsibility and impact of climate change that derives from those colonial, extractive, and exploitative and violent relations. And it also focuses and uplifts degrowth as a core climate solution, which is the idea that capitalism's imperative for constant economic growth is one of the core structural drivers of climate change. Now, for full disclosure, this is where I come from. This is the type of climate activism that I've practiced most of my life, but that's all of the more reason that we should introspect and ask ourselves the same questions. Who is this for, and what does this miss? Matt Huber's critique of this approach to climate politics is that by focusing our critique on rich nations as a whole, we miss the poor and working people in those countries. And that, therefore, by centering our climate movement on the international justice issues that overly emphasize nations in the global south, we are implicitly overlooking the needs of working people who are struggling to get by in the global north. And that because our activism is meant to target our government and thereby by extension motivate our fellow citizens, this approach will not resonate as well with people who are focused on making their ends meet as it will with those who are relatively comfortable or affluent. Now, I want to stop for a second before moving on and really dig into this because I want to make it extremely clear that there is nothing wrong or unimportant about centering international justice in terms of climate solutions. And in actuality, it is hugely important to continually center justice in our climate organizing, because there is empirical and historical facts that back this up. Not only does the legacy of colonialism and imperialist violence absolutely still play a role in these international dynamics between the North and South, but they are absolutely, by extension, a part of the conversation that must happen around climate change and the burden of the vast majority of historical emissions coming from the industrial economies of the global North, while consequences and damage that will be experienced from climate catastrophes are disproportionately felt by countries in the global South. And it is absolutely essential that we bake in international reparations in terms of how we structure our global response to the climate crisis into all of the organizing that we do. And we do need to be talking about reparations on a scale that we have never seen in human history. So how do we reconcile this tension between Matt Huber's critique that focusing on climate justice does not adequately integrate the needs of working people within the imperial core with the very real moral, strategic, and material reality of colonial injustice and the disproportionate responsibility of nations in the global North and global South when it comes to climate action? And what I want to offer as a synthesis of these two is to just spend a second to emphasize the importance of internationalism and anti-imperialism in all of the work and solidarity that we organize around. And we need to recognize that capital's power crosses borders, so should our organizing. There is no issue more inherently international than climate change. And not only will the capitalist class pit workers of different nations against each other to drive down wages through outsourcing and globalization and restrictive immigration policies, but fossil fuel extraction is one of the linchpins of imperialism. The lust for oil and minerals does inconceivable violence not only to humans, but also to the planet. And the U.S. military is the largest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases. The U.S. military burns 270,000 barrels of oil per day, which means you could be vegan your entire life and not make a dent in what the U.S. military will burn in one day to genocide people in the Middle East and extract more oil for combustion. And this is my response to Matt Huber's critique, which is this is how we get the working class to care about global justice, is by remembering that the working class is international and that our struggles at home are inseparable from those of working people abroad. Now, that was a bit of a sidetrack, but I really wanted to make sure to not leave a critique of climate justice just hanging without addressing the centrality of global justice and climate justice in our climate politics. But I'm going to return back to one of the other main policy preferences of this radical variant, which is degrowth. Again, it's a very similar dynamic where degrowth is empirically backed, and the constant growth imperative under capitalism is indeed one of the core structural drivers of the climate crisis. But when we look at how we integrate this into our climate movement, by focusing on system change, we are often asking people to learn and research what degrowth actually means and why it is not actually a threat to their material conditions. And while this is very important, we are still focusing on unlearning, which is kind of just a woke version of learning. So again, this is a very important research that we should do within the climate movement to structure our policies and our strategies. But we need to be really aware of, again, who is this for when we're doing our kind of climate organizing, And what does this miss in terms of how we communicate about these types of climate policies and climate solutions? And these tendencies of this kind of radical variant have created a resurgence of folk politics that centers small-scale agriculture, artisanal crafts, and localized resource use. Again, this is where I come from. Climate justice, degrowth, and folk politics. Like, I want to live with my friends on a commune. However, we need to recognize the fact that this impulse to retreat from the arena of capitalist economy and industrial production does not confront the class that owns production, but is indeed retreat. Rather than attempting to seize the industrial production of capitalism for human and planetary liberation, PMC radicals propose anti-industrial solutions that is out of touch with the needs and masses of workers today. Retreating from the capitalist economy in favor of living off the grid sounds awesome, but requires a lot of access to resources and wealth that is fundamentally inaccessible to the majority of working class people in our society. So we've covered a lot, and there's a lot more time that we could spend on all of these different aspects of the PMC as well as just within this radical variant. But let's step back and look at what we've been talking about in this radical variant as a whole and ask again this question: what does this miss? And how do the solutions that I have been very passionate about and the organizing that this kind of radical variant of the PMC has done up until now, how does this still emphasize a need to learn about the solutions instead of meeting people where they're at? And also, importantly, what does this all offer us in terms of strategy? All of the solutions of the radical variant that I've talked about are very empirically grounded, but what is the concrete plan to dismantle capitalism in time to avert climate catastrophe? So again, I want to reemphasize, whenever you encounter discourse or strategy or some new proposed solution, there are two questions you should keep asking. One, who is this for? And two, what does this miss? Or who is excluded from this? And this brings us to our final section of our class analysis of climate change, which is working class positionality. So we know who the working class is, but where are they situated in regards to climate change? Well, for one, we understand that the working class occupies an essential role in production. Capitalists cannot run their factories without workers to use the machines. Extractive capital cannot extract oil out of the ground, and electricity capital cannot burn that oil without workers on those offshore rigs and in those power stations. And this means that the working class is central to the gears of labor, which means that our strike action, our ability to go on labor strike, is the ultimate leverage that the working class has against the capitalist class. We control their profits because their profits are extracted from our labor. Additionally, the working class is the least insulated from climate change due to their class position. When the power grid fails during a historic freeze, it is disproportionately working people whose heat is going to turn off. And it is, while wildfires do sometimes burn down rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods indiscriminately, it is absolutely working people who are disproportionately affected by the damages of a destabilized climate. And at the same time, the working class is also the most vulnerable to economic shifts away from historic industries that rely on fossil fuels. And this is why fossil fuel dependent communities, such as coal mining communities, are often weaponized by right-wing forces opposed to climate action, because there is a very real material and economic vulnerability experienced by the working people whose livelihoods are still reliant on a fossil fuel economy in which we live. And this vulnerability is largely due to an eroded standard of living. The working class has experienced upwards of 40 years of wage stagnation in the face of rising productivity. And what this means is that historically, during the years in the United States where there was a strong and robust labor movement, economic productivity and workers' wages increased in tandem. And this makes intuitive sense. The more wealth that is generated by working people, the more of that wealth they get to enjoy. However, as the labor movement has been eroded by political reaction over the last 40 or 50 years, that relationship has increasingly been decoupled, resulting in wage stagnation in the face of rising productivity. And this has been felt on the material lives of working people through forces such as deindustrialization and the creation of what we can refer to as economic sacrifice zones. So, let's return to the question that we asked at the start of the lecture. Why isn't the climate movement working? My answer to that question is that, one, it ignores class. It has so far failed to target the economy, bosses, and workers. The climate movement so far has obscured the role that capital plays in society and misplaces blame for the climate crisis onto all of us collectively. At the same time, it has overlooked both the needs and the power of working people. And as we discussed, neither focusing on consumption, education, or broad system change offers us a concrete strategy on how we can stop climate change in time. Now, before we get into the final section of this lecture, I'm going to issue a disclaimer. I'm about to speak bluntly and be slightly provocative for a second, but there is a core takeaway from what we've talked about that I really want to emphasize. We've looked at a lot of the climate solutions that we're most familiar with seeing, and I want to argue that none of these are real solutions to climate change. Convincing climate deniers has no material impact on carbon emissions. Organizing a protest does nothing to slow climate change. Passing a policy on its own, just because you are able to get it passed, does not necessarily stop climate change. Even building renewable energy on its own does nothing to stop climate change if we are still burning the same amount of fossil fuels. All of these are means and not ends. And I want to debunk these as solutions, not to depress you, but to refresh our perspective on climate solutions with clear eyes. All of these things are important and useful because they indicate our potential and they remind us of our power. But ultimately, none of these necessarily have any impact on changing our material conditions. And when we forget that these are means and not ends, and when our methods become our goals, we cede ground to our opposition. There is only one real solution to climate change, and that is reducing emissions. And the target of our organizing must be the source of emissions and the actual industrial production of real stuff in our economy. And reducing emissions requires only two things. One, a massive reduction in fossil fuel combustion, and two, a massive build-out of energy infrastructure that does not align with the profit motive. We must have an enormous expansion of renewable energy production for the public good of a stable climate, regardless of how much it costs, regardless on whether somebody can profit off of it or not. And both of these, decreasing fossil fuel combustion and building out renewable energy require challenging the private control over energy production in our economy. So, what solutions are missing? What don't you ever hear in climate politics or discourse? Any guesses? How about nationalizing Exxon? How come, despite the apocalyptic stakes of the climate crisis, none of these political schools have remotely considered nationalizing the fossil fuel industry as a feasible solution? Why not? It is so simple. We know that 100 companies are responsible for 71% of all emissions since 1988. Why is taking over 100 companies seen as harder to do than passing 100 tiny flexible regulations or inventing new technologies like carbon capture? I would argue it's because all of the solutions that have been proposed by the climate movement so far have been those allowed by the capitalist class. I'm going to quote directly from Climate Change's Class War, which says that it is a great achievement of neoliberal ideology that policymakers today are barely able to imagine the expropriation of fossil fuel property as a conceivable option, despite the increasing severity of the crisis. Meanwhile, capitalists today have expropriated our means of survival. They have expropriated our atmosphere and turned it into their private dumping ground, and they are attempting to expropriate our planetary future. So, when we're looking at the shortcomings of the climate solutions we're familiar with, nationalizing fossil fuels clearly does confront the class dynamics underlying climate change and the power structure of our society and our economy. But what about a clear strategy? This was the other thing missing from all of the climate solutions that we looked at. Matt Huber advocates for what he calls socialism in one sector. And he said that simply gesturing for an economy-wide need for increased labor organizing is too broad, and that frankly, the climate crisis is in dire need of rapid action, and the labor movement overall right now is too weak. We need a short-term and targeted strategy in a specific sector. And in the climate struggle, he argues that that key sector is the electrical power. So he says this for a few reasons, that by focusing on electric utilities, these utility companies are already subject to intense oversight and political regulation. Electrical workers possess literal power over the economy, and this electrical utility provision is central to virtually every economic activity, while also being immune from offshoring. And the electrical utility sector is already heavily unionized. So Matt Huber argues for a three-pronged strategy to revive working class power in the electrical utility sector, which is one, a rank and file strategy of entering unions and organizing within them to promote a climate worker agenda. Two, the use of union resources to form mass political education campaigns. And three, the strategic use of strikes and disruption at the point of production to leverage the power of working people against the capitalist class. Now, most of us are likely not going to join an electrical utility union, but importantly, the labor movement is absolutely a critical tool of working people reclaiming the control of our society and our economy from the ruling class. And the point of why this socialism in one sector strategy is important to all of us is because all labor organizing is interrelated. And while we embark on a generational task of rebuilding our labor movement, we need to stay laser focused on the urgency of the climate crisis, and this socialism in one sector, in the electrical utility sector, should be the primary goal the core target of a broader class war and organizational strategy. Now, the core concept behind this strategy is that taking private ownership of life's essentials like energy and food, groceries, transit under public control is beneficial to the majority of society for two reasons. One, the working class has a material interest in doing so because public services are able to provide a higher quality service at a lower price when it comes to things like affordable housing, cheap renewable energy, and sustainable, accessible transit. And secondly, public ownership gives us the democratic control over the management of these services to bring them into alignment with environmental needs. And this is proven by research that demonstrates that public utilities are statistically much more likely to transition to renewable energy than private utilities. Their extra money that is being pocketed by corporate interests controlled in private utilities could just as easily be used to fund the transition away from fossil fuels into renewable technology. So if this is the kind of climate solution that is being proposed in relation to the critique that we've unfolded over the course of this lecture, we should be able to ask ourselves the same question that we've been asking of others, which is, why would this type of climate solution work where the others have not yet done so? And this brings us to a distinct form of climate politics, which we'll call working class environmentalism. Now, working class environmentalism centers working class power. It recognizes that the working class is the vast majority of society, over 75%, and is ethnically and racially diverse with clear, materially aligned interests. So not only does the working class represent a clear democratic majority, but they also occupy a strategic position within the gears of fossil capital. And importantly, the working class has a material interest in delivering these types of climate solutions, because by doing so, by decarbonizing our economy, we can counter wealth inequality at the same time. So working class environmentalism weds absolutely essential climate action and absolutely essential redistributive policies to improve standards of living of the majority of people in our society. Working class environmentalism also benefits from centering working class politics. It's able to leverage existing class resentments. For example, it's been an intergenerational tradition of working people to resent their bosses and hate on the rich. And it also implicitly centers the material conditions that the majority of society finds themselves in. And this is best exemplified by one of the highest profile examples of working class environmentalism, which is the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal, part of the reason that, again, 80% of Americans support a Green New Deal is because of how relentlessly it associates decarbonization and climate action with jobs, labor rights, and workers' rights. By relentlessly emphasizing the degree to which climate solutions are tethered to improvements in job opportunities and economic capacity for the working class majority, the Green New Deal is able to anticipate the material concerns that are often leveraged against existing climate policies, such as the carbon tax, and decouple a lot of the weaponization and culture war framing that reactionaries and conservatives use to weaponize working people's interests against climate solutions. So, for example, by emphasizing that public transit creates 1.4 times as many jobs as car-centered highway expansion projects, the Green New Deal is able to wed desperately needed improvements in material conditions to desperately needed efforts to decarbonize our economy. So, in the broadest perspectives, the working class environmentalism differs from the type of environmentalism that we're familiar with under fossil capital because fossil capital is defined by elite control over production, whereas in contrast, working class environmentalism centers taking democratic control over life's necessities. And again, what we're talking about here includes energy, groceries, housing, transit, healthcare, etc. Additionally, environmentalism, as we've understood it under the hegemony of fossil capital, is often defined as a politics of less, whereas working class environmentalism is premised on a politics of more. Matt Huber writes that the incessant focus of consumers and on consumption as the ultimate driver of emissions necessarily leads to what he calls austerity ecology. This focus on reducing consumption appeals to professional classes and their perceived carbon guilt, but it has no resonance with the vast majority of people already living precarious and insecure lives. For the working class, steeped as it is in basic material deprivation, we need to assert a politics of more that explains how much we have to gain from a climate program. Similarly, the climate movement under fossil capital has typically emphasized scaling back, whereas the working class environmentalism emphasizes taking over the industrial capacity of our society. And while much of the environmental left assumes that addressing the climate crisis will be done by relocalizing our relationship to food and energy systems, Huber suggests the opposite, that the planetary nature of climate change requires that we reconstruct our relationship to nature at a global scale. And he writes that the goal of all working class movements should not be to return to pre-industrial agrarian societies where we live on communes and localize our food production, but rather the goal of working class movement should take social control of what is our socialized production system. Our survival as a species requires a species-wide coordination of production. And this means that at its most fundamental, environmentalism under fossil capital has tended to emphasize individual actions, whereas working class environmentalism is rooted in collective solidarity. And we've seen this work. We saw this work in British Columbia with the election of Emily Lowen as the leader of the BC Green Party, and also in the States with Zoran Mamdani. Their messages both resonated with working class people while also pushing climate issues in a class-informed context. Building a movement based on solidarity feels amazing, and it works. When we're confronting some of the darkest, most existential issues, our resistance should be beautiful and life-giving. And these examples show us that we can push forward a movement of drastic climate action and a message of climate justice effectively when we examine our blind spots and center the needs of working people in our climate politics. We are not separate from our environment, and our environmental politics cannot be separate from our daily lives. And as deeply entwined as our lives are with our environment, so too are our lives deeply entwined with the other members of the working class. And when we center this, we can bring millions of people into our climate movement, and we can win the fight against climate change. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this lecture. I hope you learned something useful or got a refreshed perspective on how we can address some of the shortcomings and obstacles that we've encountered as we've organized in the face of the climate crisis. And again, if you have any more questions, I recommend looking into the writing done by Matt Huber, the book Climate Change is Class War, and some of the other resources that are available online, and the policy approaches taken by this rising surge of class-informed climate politics. Look into Zoran Mamdani, look into Emily Lowen, look into the Green New Deal, and always stay introspective and also stay hopeful when we're organizing together, building solidarity, and trying to tackle the most important issue facing us today.